This is a presentation which was given to various committees to introduce the assessment report in May of 2019. So first up, the highlights. And putting this into context, this report comes out of our relaunch of assessment. It's got a new philosophy. That is to say, it's much more inquiry-driven. There's a new process to discuss the results of assessment. We've got new forms, we have a new website, and we have a new way to store the data and the reports on what we're doing in assessment. So a little background. Again, the old approach to assessment was very much a sort of big data empiricism model. We were all asked to gather data on various outcomes, and the idea was to generate a data pool which would show us patterns. But this was problematic for all kinds of reasons. It was a tremendous duplication of work for faculty who gauge student data anyway. It was involved a lot of awkward systems, attempts to try to draw conclusions about data points which actually represented extremely different student engagements. The data is not really representative because some outcomes end up being assessed for, 8 students. It was very difficult to do anything with it, and it often stopped us from getting on with the kinds of things we thought might be useful. So we've moved away from that model, and instead we're looking at embracing the other, sorry for my slightly amateurish thing there. We're embracing the other aspect of scientific inquiry, and that is the experimental model. That is to say, we assume we've already got some big picture information based on our student achievement data, which is, of course, a very comprehensive database, and also our work every day with students. So instead of starting with data gathering to find a question, we start with a question, and then we gather the data that helps us answer the question. It relies on intentional, purposeful question. It doesn't necessarily require a huge data pool. It doesn't necessarily require expertise in data analysis if you're answering a fairly straightforward question. And it does mean that we will focus our attention where it is needed. So in short, what has changed? We used to start with data collection. Now we start with a question. We used to assess SLOs or courses, programs, what have you, when it was their turn. Now, because we're starting with a question, we're starting with the question that we think is most important. The old method seemed to have a prohibition in it which was never fully articulated or really justified against using course grades, or even, as according to some faculty, in-class work, which of course makes this project impossible. However, when you start with a question, you should use the data that actually answers that question instead of putting some data off limits. So whatever data would answer your research question is what you should use. The old approach seemed to focus on building a kind of key success indicator style data pool, like course grades or rates of withdrawal or transfer or course completion or degrees. These are great data pools which have outcomes for every student, every semester, disaggregated by a host of different factors. But SLO data, the breakdown of student learning, that nebulous, hard to gauge thing behind the grades, is phenomenally difficult to build a meaningful data pool, and indeed incompatible with our CSM culture. So instead of that, it's a more narrative approach. Each year, a department or discipline or service says, we want to find out this, we want to improve this, we think this is an area where we need to know more about what students are doing so we can help them get better. And that will lead to an activity which will be reported on. And that's a much easier thing to keep track of. If somebody walks into a department, they should be able to read the assessment plan from the years previous to their arrival and understand what's been going on. The old system called for us to use an awful lot of alignment in order to generate generalizations. we did a lot of mapping of program outcomes, institutional outcomes to course outcomes. Now, we still do that. That is still a key thing. But the goal of the map used to be implicitly to build a network of tubes between the different outcomes so that we could generalize about, say, critical thinking by gathering up, sucking up all the data points associated with outcomes that are aligned with the critical thinking outcome. That generates a lovely chart, but it is, in our experience anyway, next to useless for actually seeing or understanding anything or doing anything. So instead, the mapping activity is now part of how we review our curriculum for cohesion, for currency, and for clarity. It's something that Guided Pathways are doing. So again, we don't want to duplicate, have people map outcomes for an SLO activity and then turn around and do the curriculum inventory for Guided Pathways. It's the same idea. So it's really meant to help the faculty in disciplines to understand how well their programs, courses, are supporting the students in general education and supporting the students in the major. And finally, our old process really focused on a compliance mandate. For God's sakes, get your data in by this date in the semester. However, we didn't look so much at what you should do with it. We told people they should do things with it, but we didn't make time in their working semester to do that. It wasn't associated with any institutional activities like Flex Day workshops, or it was associated with program review. But again, there was no departmental requirement to talk about assessment. So it has now become, in effect, a reflection mandate. The way we've structured it, we expect disciplines to set aside time in August or September or October to discuss what they want to look at, to make a plan and to follow up on it. So, and we've got a lot of workshops on Flex Days. There's also different, a much tighter connection to assessment, to planning. So from the discipline service faculty perspective at the grassroots level, it's an annual thing. It begins in fall. You create an assessment plan, you document results. Every 2 years, you summarize that in program review. You should have the documents all ready for you. From a top-down perspective, however, the College Assessment Committee, which FYI has merged with the Committee on Academic Excellence, which handles workshops, and the Library Advisory Committee, which looks at ways to support students and faculty in kind of academic support, especially around information competency, but other things too. Those committees have now all merged into a committee on teaching and learning. So the College Assessment Committee, with the help of the Committee on Teaching and Learning that it is now part of, their goal is to do top-down stuff, right? To try to get big pictures of assessment on campus, to organize interdisciplinary assessment activities for faculty, which take place typically in a fall August workshop with a follow-up in spring, but also for students, which is typically a student activity in the spring. And then every 2 years, or maybe every 1 year, haven't finalized that yet, to summarize the college-wide activities in an assessment report in which we have also read and discussed what we're seeing in trends in the assessment plans, which are submitted every year. The College Assessment Committee, along with the Academic Senate and the other committees in the CTL, will now read and analyze program reviews from a lot of perspectives, including equity and distance ed and all other issues, but also from the point of view of assessments. So again, the faculty are doing these bottom-up activities. The College Assessment Committee is organizing big picture activities, and this is all brought together in a big program review assessment, which in turn will generate ideas for big picture activities, recommendations for Flex Day, faculty support, professional development. So what happened in 2018, 2019? It was very much an opening day. About 19 disciplines submitted assessment plans. Everybody, however, included assessment planning in their program reviews. So that's still the format most people were used to. The College Assessment Committee read and discussed these program reviews in April, And they did, in fact, as time of recording, they did discuss these assessment plans also at their meeting on May the 20th. There were a lot of themes in assessment: improving pedagogy, improving the effectiveness of the program. A lot of them were very discipline or skill specific, but a lot of them addressed things that touch on many different disciplines. And here was one which really stood out of the 19 assessment plans: writing and critical thinking. So here is an example of something which may end up being a spur to a bigger project. This shows the assessment committee where to focus its big picture attention. What next? Should we have more results? Again, we can look also at the program reviews that were submitted. We want to develop flex activities and workshops that will bring together faculty around these shared concerns. I think, again, a great idea would be to identify a college-wide project maybe for 2019-2020. Now, what about the top-down stuff from not from program reviews, but from the assessment committee activities? We organized in fall and spring of 18-19 an ILO workshop on effective communication, critical thinking, and quantitative reasoning. And faculty got together, about 5 faculty for each group. They created a rubric, a shared rubric, which could make sense in their different disciplines, to gauge each of these 3 ILOs. And then we had a follow-up in March where participating faculty and other faculty got together to discuss what came of that. It was a little open-ended. This is something that is a work in progress. We want to improve those faculty, interdisciplinary faculty assessment, rubric style activities so that we can really get some useful in-course information that we can really analyze and do something with. But the conversation was very good, very useful, and very effective. In April, we had another student focus group. Now, this is something too we've worked on over the years. Our student focus group in April included the learning community of the Promise Scholars and Mana, Umoja, and Puente. About 17 students took part. It was a really interesting focus group. We asked them a raft of questions which did not specifically identify the ILOs, but which were intended to elicit information from them that reflects the ILOs. And you can see this in this part of the assessment report. Questions that kind of, in answering them, students would tell us something about their abilities to effectively communicate, about how they felt about quantitative reasoning, and so on. We came away with a number of thoughts based on that particular activity, which we did in connection with the learning coordinators, Fee from Mana and Ali Fast from Year 1 Promise. And so that's going to be a regular feature, a learning community activity. It could be a focus group, it could be a discussion panel, a bonding activity, but which is intended also to give us a sense of how students are putting together this interdisciplinary work. And we discussed that at the assessment committee meeting in May, and we will also be following up with it in 2019-2020. These were some of the highlights, as you see in the report. There were focus group themes on connection, motivation, attitudes to ILOs, which is very interesting. Again, I think it's really important that we didn't simply ask them, how well do you feel you write sentences, or how well do you feel you can interpret graphs? These are issues which are often addressed and usefully aided by coming at them from the side. For instance, what kind of teacher interaction helps them learn best, that sense of connection with the teacher, that's going to affect all their learning outcomes. The attitudes to ILOs, however, that was very interesting. It was interesting to hear whether they felt these ILOs meant anything to them and corresponded to what they'd been doing. And finally, we had a quick look at, again, things we might want to do next. Again, maybe we want to keep working on that rubric activity, on the student ILO activity. We want to keep working on our flex activities. I'd also add we're working more closely with PRE. We might want to identify a college-wide project. So looking forward in 2019-2020 to a refinement of this process And this is putting in context the contents of our assessment report.